Hello and welcome to this uni course video. My name is Ashley and the topic of today's session is developing critical thinking. Now, a couple of learners have asked me to deliver a session on this unit, which is loosely based around unit 503, or critical thinking is, it's a really interesting concept. It's a really interesting subject, and we are going to delve into it into a little bit more detail. So we're going to be thinking about critically reflecting, critically analysing, and we're going to look at different tools and techniques that can help with that as well. We're also going to be looking at a little bit of theory in this session today. So hopefully you all stay with me. So let's just talk about firstly what is critical thinking. Now, the online dictionary define critical thinking as disciplined thinking that is clear, that is rational, open-minded, and informed by evidence. It's basically a mode of thinking about any subject, content, or problem in which the thinker improves the quality of their thinking by, analysing it, assessing it, reconstructing them thoughts. For a leader and a manager, having good critical thinking skills will help you to be an effective communicator, an effective problem solver, as well as, critical thinking. It is an art. It's an art of analysing and evaluating thinking with the viewpoint of improving it. So working on your critical thinking skills is a key developmental tool if you're wanting to improve your leadership or management, practice. Critical thinking is self-directed. It's self-disciplined, self-monitored, and about self-corrective thinking. So it's all about you. And the dictionary also define it as a mental process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analysing, synthesizing, and evaluating information to reach an informed conclusion or answer. So just consider for a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds even how or if you are a critical thinker. Is it something that you do naturally, or do you think that you may need to use some tools or techniques to help you to become better at critical thinking? So let's just bring it back a little bit to how it is that we actually think. Now, I'm not going to go, into psychotherapy or, behavioral management or anything like that. I'm just going to break it down into values, beliefs, attitudes, and emotions, really. So, breaking it up into the different sides, values and beliefs sit right at the root of what drives someone to operate and interact the way that they do. Virtually everything that we do as human beings, for example, even contributing to a discussion, is regulated by our belief systems, our associative values, and how we see ourselves, our identity, really. And our identity sits right at the core of what makes a person who they are. It incorporates values, beliefs, accompanying characteristics, experience, and perceptions. So we'll talk about that a little bit more detail later on, about perceptions. But there's two questions, and I've said beliefs are concepts that we hold to be true. Beliefs and values determine our attitudes and our emotions, really. But consider these questions when thinking to yourself: is this is this a value? Is this something I aspire to or aim to be like? And then think, is this something I consider to be true and act accordingly? So think about that. Beliefs drive behaviour, but also consider that limiting beliefs, um, can stop us from doing things that we want to do. And, that could be what you're assuming, what you assume in your own mind, basically. Your assumptions can sometimes limit your behaviour, and stop you from doing things that you think that you can do. And the way reality is interpreted shape our performance in the workplace. So, thinking about these perceptions, you can think of, this, for example, if you're about to do a presentation and you say, I really don't want to do this presentation. I'm bad at presentations, but you're building that perception based on a meeting that you had 2 years ago with a really arrogant manager who interrupted you 5 times while you were making a presentation and then said that presentation was okay. That presentation might have been amazing, but that manager might have just been arrogant, or it might have been this style of leadership or management, or he may just not have had time to actually be present in that meeting at that moment in time. Who knows? But you build your perception based on past experience. Values are essentially standards and conditions that relate to what you consider important and necessary for you to be content and satisfied. It's important, and it's highly productive to have goals that work alongside your values, consistent with what is important to you, really. And it can still be the case that the organisational values don't really align with your values, but you might still be able to have the right attitude to actually still work in that environment and meet that goal. So, and when we talk about attitudes, attitudes are personal views, basically. It doesn't mean that someone's being rude having an attitude. The attitude is just a personal view. It's a opinion or a general feeling about something in particular. So the attitudes of individuals at work, they can be positive, they can be negative, they can be helpful, they can be unhelpful. Individual attitudes will affect their contribution and involvement in dialogue or rational discourse. So consider that when we talk about the topic of emotions are basically strong feelings about somebody or something. The main difference between feelings and emotions is that an external factor induces feelings, whereas emotions can be entirely from, they can be entirely internalized. Many decisions and contributions to the dialogue we make are made because of how we feel or how we expect we're going to feel. Emotions can stunt or disrupt clear thinking. Also, emotions have the potential to unite and create bonds and develop relationships in the workplace, or have negative feelings towards specific ideas, for example. So it's important when we're thinking, when we're looking at critical thinking, that we understand the difference and the reasoning between beliefs, values, emotions, and attitudes as well. Another key point that we need to focus on when we're looking at the background and how we develop the skills of critical thinking is logic. And Merriam-Webster Dictionary define logic as a proper or reasonable way of thinking about or understanding something. So the same process of making sense or sense checking really is part of everyday everyday management, really everyday management and the activities of management, where managers, based on rational argument and logic, seek to make decisions and act in situations that arise of solving problems, something like that. So when we look at critical thinking, there's a couple of different ways in which we can go about, thinking critically. We can analyze our own thoughts, we can evaluate our thoughts, thinking positive, negatives, finding different information to be able to make an informed judgment. We can think what is logical and rational in this situation. Um, we can think of, is this argument valid or invalid? Valid arguments set out the truth of a situation and are compelling or convincing, or are based on usually loads of evidence and proof. The less subjectivity in an argument, the more valid it's likely to be. And we have difficulty presenting the truth where a statement reflects, the facts of reality. The reality of one person as well might differ from the reality of another. We think about how we perceive things based on experience and knowledge and skills and truth. But it's, thinking about different ways to foresee how we think about things, to think about how we can reflect upon our own thoughts, to be able to use the right questioning approaches to develop that reasoning, to use the right analysis or evaluation or gathering of evidence to actually be able to make an informed judgment is what helps us and allows us to be, the best that we can be in relation to critical thinking. So it's not just about thinking about how we perceive things, but how others perceive things in order to understand the whole truth, in order for it to be logical. So, reasoning, when we look at reasoning, it's about making observations, drawing conclusions, and how we basically apply reasonings can be done in like two different ways: deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning. Now, I do apologise for this slide, it is a little bit wordy. I like to include at least one that's wordy in there, but pause it if you need to and have a good look at the definition. Deductive reasoning is more about confirming what we already know, and inductive reasoning is more about exploring different factors, and understanding what's out there. It's about observing and looking and searching for patterns. And you probably see that can be done in, might be if you wanted to, do a review of your financial accounts over the years to see where you was and where you was 5 years ago and where you are now. It might be looking at your KPIs. It might be quite data orientated. But here's some examples for a deductive. If machine A breaks down, then production's going to suffer. You probably know that through maybe past experience, or there's been specific situations to prove that will be the truth and that will be logical. Whereas the example for inductive reasoning could be, we won our last 4 tenders, therefore we're going to win the next one. So it's, thinking about the patterns in order to make informed judgments. And there is different ways of like testing theories. A theory, a theory can be defined as a set of assumptions, propositions, or accepted facts that attempts to provide a plausible or rational explanation of cause and effect relationships among the group of observed. So think about that when we talk about testing theories. So it's usually done by either experimentation or observation. So think about that when you're looking at reasoning. So you want to develop reasoning, you want to develop logic in order to be able to consider different arguments in your own mind, or different ways of thinking, or new ways of working, or new ways of thinking. So testing theories is a great way to do that. And in university, you might get told to use experimentations. So basing predictions, or predictions are made from a theory and after an experiment is undertaken. So an example could be two groups are set up. One is expected to a stimulus, and the other acts as a control group with no stimulus. If the group with the stimulus reacts according to the prediction, then the theory is confirmed. So it's testing something to make something plausible. Observation, on the other hand, predictions are made from a theory and observation of a relevant situation, and data is undertaken with no external stimulus. So the observation confirms whether or not the theory is consistent with the situation. So it might be more of a trial and error situation. Well, let's trial this, let's observe the results, and let's see what the outcome is. And a lot of research, in different fields and different industries, obviously, but you might be able to look at reports and have a little look at, experimentation in this specific area of leadership and management, observation. So, for example, in coaching and mentoring, something I'm studying at the moment, there is quite a lot of research going into now, different ways of evaluating the effectiveness of coaching and mentoring, and observation is a really good way now to test the effectiveness of coaching and mentoring over like distal outcomes, like over a measurement of time. So for different industries, you might want to use different ways to test theories in order to consider the different reasoning, in order to be able to link in with that logic, and for you to be able to think a little bit more outside of the box, to be able to make informed judgments in your own mind, or categorize your way of thinking, really. So before we talk about critical thinking models, I just want to touch upon key characteristics, really, of critical thinkers. Um, if you do your research on it, there's absolutely loads of different ways that characteristics can be categorized in emotional intelligence, in critical thinkers. But skepticism is probably one of the ones that you will see come up probably the most, and it's accepting nothing at face value. When presented with an argument, you might say to yourself, who's saying that? Are they credible? What's their motive? Are they biased in any way? What evidence do you have to back up that? So it's, having that skepticism, which isn't always a bad thing, especially when, you don't want mistakes to occur again and again. Making sure information's viable and credible and relevant and up to date is quite important. Self-awareness is the next one. That comes up in emotional intelligence models, which I'm going to touch upon at the end. But as well as recognizing bias in others, critical thinkers are conscious of their own beliefs and assumptions, like I've just mentioned then, their own perceptions of how they see things. So they'll guard against confirmation bias, so prioritizing data that supports their own belief. They'll think about unconscious preconceptions that affect the reasoning. So, if if they're always thinking one thing, they might think, okay, well, what do others think about this? Because maybe what I'm thinking isn't always right. And, pattern seeking. So thinking about how mistakes have happened before, maybe it's good to think outside of the box. And that leads to the third characteristic, really. So curiosity. Critical thinkers base decisions on a dispassionate analysis of data from various sources. They seek the truth by being open to looking for new information, by seeking opposing views to be able to make an objective judgment. They'll look for ways to reassess their beliefs in light of new evidence, and they'll look for new evidence to disprove their own theories and their own thoughts upon it. There's an absolutely brilliant table by D'Angela in the information pack in Unit 503 on Moodle that differentiates between his thoughts on the difference between the average thinker and the critical thinker. Really, really good and interesting table, to be honest. So have a little look at that if you're working on Unit 503, or if you're working on a unit that links in with critical thinking and you'd like that information, drop me an email and I'll send it to you. But yeah, let's look. I don't want to go into too much detail because I really don't want this session to be over an hour. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of critical thinking models and techniques. If you are sitting there and going, wow, this is completely something new to me, but I would like to develop my critical thinking skills, there are models and tools and techniques that can help you to do that. And there's different ways of, developing yourself as a reflective practitioner, as a critical thinker, and building on your emotional intelligence to be, the best leader or manager that you can be. And here are just a number of them. Bloom's taxonomy, I'm going to touch upon first, as this was probably my awakening to critical thinking. This was when I first started teaching. It looked at the classification of learning outcomes and objectives, and it helped to frame how Bloom felt about cognitive thinking. So basically, he believes that there's different levels of thinking, and if you think about it from a teacher's perspective, it's about looking at how other people perceive that knowledge and developing the thinking upwards. So the basic one would be knowledge. So thinking about just things of like weighing, listing things off or describing things how they are. And then comprehension looks at thinking a little bit more outside the box. Application is about understanding and knowing and doing. And analysis is about understanding, knowing, doing, and being able to break the whole topic up into sections. And then evaluate is about, once you've thought about breaking them into sections, looking at the pros and cons of each of them sections in order to make a judgment. And then, when you're thinking about synthesis as well, you're also thinking about bringing in other people's ideas in order to be able to formulate informed judgments that are, using other people's thoughts to be able to think more critically. So Bloom's is a good one. It's a good one to be able to think the levels of comprehension. So thinking about where you can work your way up through the levels when looking at Bloom's taxonomy. But Watson Glaser's critical thinking model, it's designed to evaluate the ability of a person to absorb information, then understand its significance, and then assess situations based on the information provided. And it's broken down into it utilizes 3 different concepts: recognizing assumptions, evaluating arguments, and then drawing conclusions following on from that. So just think about that. If you, as a critical thinker, examine the information for comprehension and understanding, consider whether that information presented is accurate, and decide whether there's sufficient evidence to back it up. To recognise assumptions, you must correctly identify when assumptions are going to be, are being made. So it's about understanding what are assumptions, what are facts, what are opinions, and being able to recognise that, and then being able to evaluate them arguments as well. So thinking systematically about the different arguments, and some people even might want to draw a diagram and make a table and think about the positives, the negatives, and the recommendations, opinions, outcomes, in order to be able to then draw conclusions, pulling together the various sources of information and arriving at logical conclusions based on evidence. So yeah, a really good one, that really good starting point, that, and you can use diagrams and tables to help you with that. The Paul Elder framework, it suggests that thinkers improve the quality of their thinking by skillfully taking charge of the ability to reason, determining the quality of the reasoning and consistency, applying the standards of thinking to develop intellectual traits, if you like. So this as well has got it's got three primary components. So the elements of thought, which looks at the reasoning, the universal intellectual standards, which is related to the quality of that reasoning, and then intellectual traits, which basically looks at the standards of thinking, and looks at things like intellectual courage, intellectual empathy, intellectual autonomy, integrity, and perseverance. So you can break it down. This framework really does allow for you to be able to manage your thinking into different stages and elements, really. Some people may have heard of the Adelphi project. Basically, the American Philosophical Association, APA, commissioned a national Delphi study years ago to develop a consensus characterization of critical thinking. And it formulated, there was like 46 experts with recognised expertise in critical thinking, instruction, theory and assessment. They came up with a list, basically, of all the skills and sub-skills that are necessary for critical thinking. And they found that critical thinking to be purposeful, self-regulatory, and basically a great way for leaders to be able to develop and enhance the team, the organisation of a whole. So, if you have time to look at the Delphi study, go in, have a look at it. It's really interesting. And okay, it's not as much as a framework and a model that you can follow, but you can look at the skills and the sub-skills that are included, and that can help you formulate your ways of thinking, or maybe your ways of reflecting on the way that you think, to be able to improve moving forward. The wheel of thinking, summarised, it's a great way to regulate your judgments, and it looks at things like different ways of solving problems, making decisions, constructing effective arguments, establishing truths, shifting your perspective completely. And obviously that's not always easy. That's not always easy. So it breaks that down a little bit further. Planning strategically as well. So having a plan of action for the future, positive and negative effects on the different choices that you might be able to make. So breaking that down, you know, critical thinking is the ability to think in an organized, analytical, and a rational manner to understand the connections between what are ideas and what are facts, for yourself and in the workplace generally, really. Critical thinking is the process of thinking about your thinking. So remember that it's about identifying, analysing, and fixing flaws in your way of thinking, if you like. So using these different models, tools, tables, frameworks, even argument mapping. It's brilliant, and it's sort of it's about being able to put down on paper, maybe using boxes, arrows, or it belongs to the same family of mind mapping, really. But it's about being able to structure um, a way of thinking or an argument, and it helps the person to basically decide by weighing up the evidence against specifics. And it's a great way to be able to identify fact from fiction as well. So have a little look into these in a little bit more detail, because if you really want to develop your way of thinking, the best way to do that is to use the tools and techniques to be able to, and the models, theories, frameworks, to be able to move you forward and be able to think a little bit more critically. There are exercises that you can use that work alongside some of these theoretical models. So, if there is one that you think, I really like the sound of that, I think I could work with that to develop my critical thinking skills, drop me an email, and it's more than likely that I might have an exercise or a specific activity that might be able to work alongside you working within that model or theory. So let's move on to reflective practice. Now, talking about critical thinking, it's critical thinking. It's about thinking about the way that we think, really. Now, the main way, or the first instance and the primary way that I started developing my critical thinking skills was through reflective practice. Reflective practice critically analyzes what you do and how you do it, why you did it, when, what you learned from it, what actions you're going to take in future to improve it, for example. And they're just sort of titles from a reflective blog that I use. But it's about listening to ourselves, observing our actions, and then being able to face up to our own assumptions. Now, you live and you learn at the end of the day, and sometimes it's easier to learn and face up to your own assumptions if you are continuously reflecting upon and listening to your own thoughts and ideas about what you're doing. So once we've been able to listen to ourselves and face up to our own assumptions and maybe reflect upon that in a log or a journal or however way you want to, go about reflecting upon your practice, you may be able to then start noticing patterns. And patterns are great sometimes if something's working well and you do X, Y, and Z, and then great things happen. But noticing patterns in your thoughts might allow you to understand how you perceive things, and it might sometimes be good to be able to mix that up and think about changing what we see. So, changing what we see in order to be able to change the way that we see things. So, always following your listening to yourself, following your own assumptions, and working the same way all the time isn't always the best way. Changing what we see and the way we see things is it's really, really big. It's part of reflective practice. You know, some people would say that a new person coming into the organisation and throwing out their ideas when something's already working well is a bad thing. But understanding their perceptions and observing how they are thinking about doing things might be a great new way of working within your organisation. So it's important for us to be able to understand how other people, um, you know, how other people's assumptions are formed, or how other people's perceive things, and why they perceive them that way, in order to understand whether the assumptions that we make are correct, or maybe could be debated with, or argued with, or maybe changed in the foreseeable. So, theories of management. So this unit also focuses on how critical thinking can impact the way that we manage. Now, there are a number of different management theories, and again, I could take all day talking about each of these theories, but I will just touch upon them in a little bit of detail, and you think to yourself how critical thinking and how good critical thinking skills would impact on the way that we manage people. So, firstly, scientific theory by Frederick Taylor. We could define that as simplifying tasks, dividing work equally, and using incentives to get the best out of the people. But I don't really like this style of management, because it's like people are like the people in the workplace are maybe like rats in a lab or something that are performing just for the cheese at the end. And I don't think that everybody's incentivized in that way. I don't think that, if you think about the way people are either motivated internally or externally, it wouldn't always work for everybody. So, but think how critical thinking could link in with that. Administration theory by Henry Fayol is about upper management and upper management command and control. Have a little think about how that would translate to the people underneath. Human relationship theory by Elton Mayo. So this is more about the promotion of social interactions within an organisation. You could even think about, linking it with the X and Y theory by Douglas McGregor, which links in with motivational theory. And he basically believes that the lazy X people are controlled, and the motivated Y are awarded, and that's their way of management. Then systems leadership was by Ludwig, and he believes that system-wide coordination between every department is how systems theory works. Basically believing that departments should play together, stay together. And then there's bureaucratic theory, which was developed by Max Weber, and that's more of like a hierarchical structure, adhering to really strict rules and ways of working and policies and procedures and all of that. So have a little think about how critical thinking could impact on the way that we manage. Would the most highly or best critical thinkers want to work in a systems theory management environment? Would they? So have a little think about that, because it does come up. And then moving swiftly on to back onto reflection. Think about the different levels of reflection when you're looking about management theory and critical thinking. Think about simple reflection. So basically reflection without not having a purpose. So you may have just said, I had a cup of 10 minutes ago. You're just reflecting on something you've done. Critical reflection, which is, contemplation with evaluation. So you might be like, I had a cup of 10 minutes ago, but I didn't have one this morning. Therefore, I haven't really had that much caffeine. I usually have about 3 a day. So do you know what? I'll have a cup of tea. So it's just thinking in a little bit more detail. And then critical thinking might be more like, I didn't have one this morning, but, I had one 10 minutes ago. But if I was to think about how much caffeine I should really be having in the day, and how many times you've made a cup, or maybe it's my turn to make a cup at this time, and you're thinking about all different areas before you come to that judgment at the end. So remember that when you are thinking critically, you will be looking at the different levels. And again, when looking at reflective practice, there's tools to help you with reflective practice, which can then help you to become a really good critical thinker. Gibbs is absolutely brilliant at just breaking down, and you could break this down into like a reflective log if you wanted. Every time you had a meeting or dealt with a problem or a situation, or every time you gave feedback, every time you had a disciplinary an interview, you might want to look at what happened in the description, how you felt about it, what was good about it, what was bad about it, what were your thoughts on it, what was the conclusion, what else could you have done. You might analyse it, what sense can you make of the situation, and then think about what you do differently in the future. That is critical thinking. That is you learning how to categorise your thoughts in a way that can help you, become more self-aware of your thoughts. And then once you get a grasp with critical thinking, you might then want to consider developing your emotional intelligence. And developing your critical thinking and emotional intelligence can go hand in hand. Now, emotional intelligence involves a combination of competencies which allow a person to become aware, to understand, and to be in control of their own emotions. So, to recognize and understand the emotions of not just themselves but others, and to use this knowledge to foster their success and the success of others as well. So, there's 3 different types. According to research, there's probably more than that, but there's 3 popular types of emotional intelligence models. Most people will have heard of Daniel Goleman, and if you search the net, you'll probably find loads of videos and on YouTube of Daniel Goleman and his emotional intelligence model. So that's the one I'm just going to talk about mostly, but I think it's within 503, or it might be within one of the other units that link with critical thinking. It does ask to talk about 2 different theories of emotional intelligence. So have a look at the other 2. But for time, I'm just going to talk about Daniel Goleman's, because again, it's the most recent, and it looks at basically not just the ability-based models, not just the trait models, which that say that basically people have as part of their personalities several emotional self-perceptions and traits that can help them with becoming emotionally intelligent. But it's more of a mixed approach. So it's based into 4 different areas: self-awareness, and when we look at critical thinking, that's one of the key aspects as well. Self-management, which is about self-control, trustworthiness, adaptability, achievement, orientation, taking the initiative, things like that. Social awareness, which is about having empathy, but sensing what others are feeling and being able to understand situations from other people's perspectives, therefore cultivating relationships with a diverse range of people, and then being able to use what you know to handle your emotions. Social skills is pointed out, but handle your emotions in respect to relationships of other people. So it helps you to be able to develop relationships more effectively, be able to manage social interactions more effectively, be able to lead more effectively, be able to develop other people more efficiently, to be able to communicate better, to be able to manage conflict better, to be able to build bonds, to negotiate better. So, you understanding now why critical thinking leads to emotional intelligence leads to great leadership and management. It's all connected. And, in order to be the best that you possibly can be, it's important to be able to think about how you can manage your development to become the best that you can be within leadership or management. And keeping a continuous development plan, keeping a reflective log, always managing your own performance as well as allowing for your organisation to manage your performance is a skill, and it's a way of working really. But yeah, this unit and units at this level will be asking you to be able to critically assess yourself. So remember, use the ILM assignment guidance if you need it to just understand what the question is actually asking you about. But you will be needing to draw from theory. You might want to use self-assessments, feedback from other people, consider using evidence, research reports that you've read up on, books, literature reviews, and make sure that you point to specific criteria when forming an assessment as well. We've talked about logic, we've talked about different ways of working, different ways of thinking, different ways of characterising our thinking, and our own truths. I read this quote, and I think it's like a nice fitting way to end. Everything you see, hear, or experience in any way at all is specific to you. You create a universe by perceiving it. So everything in that universe you perceive is specific to you. Douglas Adams said that. And what he basically means by that, or what he endorses, is that people will see things differently. We all have different experiences, levels of knowledge, abilities, preferences, likes, different, dislikes, things like that. Despite the common ground reflected in an organization's culture, we might not always see things in the same way. These differences aren't a bad thing. Sometimes being able to see how others perceive things might work well for an absolutely great team. Diversity and different perceptions drive much of the creativity and innovation in organizations and can make organizations really, really effective. So it's important to be able to remember that when you're thinking outside the box, when you're thinking critically. So that concludes my session today on critical thinking. There is a lot that we've gone through today, and I may think about categorizing this session into smaller sessions, such as emotional intelligence and management theory, for example. But, the key points to take away from this is critical thinking is about reflecting upon the way you think, be able to categorize and think about different ways in order to be able to make informed judgments, really. And there are many different models, tools, and techniques to help with that, as I've mentioned. If you would like any more information on this topic, please contact me, drop me an email, and I may be able to send you some additional resources for further reading. But thank you for watching today. Bye.